Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the CPC Winter Seminar. I'm delighted to introduce Jennifer Allen. She's an incoming assistant professor at New York University in the Stern Business School there, and currently slumming it with Duncan Watts at UPenn, doing a postdoc over there. I think I'll keep my introduction of Jen short by just saying, if I were to look through all of our citations in our misinformation work, she might be the most cited person. Ryan, what do you think about that? Does that sound about right?
That's about right, yeah.
Yeah. Not only most cited, but just has done foundational work that changed the way that, that myself and my research group thinks about misinformation. In particular, the really large scale, but also close analysis of data that really was some of the first insights into how prevalent misinformation was, but also how it isn't that prevalent when we think about it in terms of other kinds of content. And that was one of the first papers, one of Jen's, that got us thinking about that. And so she's been hugely influential here. We're delighted to have her. So please join me in welcoming Jen.
Oh, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And certainly likewise in terms of your work and my papers. So today I'm going to present a topic that I think is particularly and perhaps unfortunately relevant about quantifying the impact of misinformation and vaccine skeptical content on Facebook. Can everyone hear me all right? Is the mic? Okay, great. So as I'm sure many of us are aware, it's a pretty turbulent time in terms of content moderation, especially as it pertains to misinformation on social media. And so, I think just last week, Meta announced that it was ending its partnership with third-party fact-checkers in the U.S., claiming that fact-checking was overreach. And so given kind of all of this turbulence and, executive orders and policy changes, I think it is potentially helpful to reflect on why Meta felt the need to introduce these programs in the first place. And so misinformation has been, implicated in a wide variety of societal events and societal challenges, beginning with the election of, Donald Trump in 2016 and the emergence of fake news into our kind of cultural lexicon. Something funky is happening here. After this event, that was the kind of introduction of fact checkers on Facebook as a means to kind of combat misinformation on the platform. But misinformation didn't stop there, of course, and it has been implicated in other events, of course, the 2020 presidential election and the storming the Capitol, and beyond just politics, also public health in terms of vaccine resistance, especially around the COVID pandemic. During this time, 2020, Meta was really scaling its fact-checking program. Fact-checking was used to identify and debunk false stories, on the platform. And so, it's not just Meta, also other platforms use fact-checking as well, like YouTube and Twitter. But the goal, Meta had, I think, kind of the broadest program. The stated goal of the program was to address viral misinformation, and in particular, clear hoaxes that had no basis in fact. And partners prioritized provably false claims that were timely, trending, and consequential. And so this is taken from Meta's guide on third-party fact-checking. And so the way that the system works was content was sent to Meta's third-party fact-checkers. They flagged it as misinformation or false or partly false, and then it was shown with this label and feed, and it was demoted. That's all well and good, but I'm going to show you an example of how this actually worked. So this is from around 2020, 2021, kind of the heyday of fact-checking on Facebook. And so this story here is an example of something that Facebook identified as false using the third-party fact-checking program. The headline here, for if you can read it, is Canadians face major donut shortage after first day of cannabis legalization. So this is a false story. This didn't actually happen. And fact checkers went and vetted and labeled it as false, and Facebook took actions against it. However, this story here, military ballots found in trash in Pennsylvania, most were Trump votes, was not labeled as false or misinformation by Facebook's third-party fact checkers. And in fact, the story, was not false, provably false in the strict sense of the word. Military ballots were found in the trash in Pennsylvania. Most were Trump votes, but what this headline fails to mention is that 8 votes were found. 6 of them were for Trump. And there was no evidence that this was there was no evidence that this was widespread voter fraud. But nonetheless, this story was viewed over 100 million times on Facebook in the lead up to the 2021 election. It was actually the most viewed story URL on the platform during this time period. It wasn't just this one story. There was a lot of coverage of this event by reputable outlets such as ABC News here. So we look at this example. Do we really feel good about this? Would we say that this is a broad success, that this type of content is getting demoted in feed, whereas we're not taking kind of any action, and this kind of content is allowed to be kind of the most popular on Facebook? I think another relevant consideration in this topic is what Jeff was alluding to earlier, which is that when it comes to media consumption in the US, fake news of the kind of obviously false hoax variety makes up less than 0.1% of overall information consumption. And so even though stories like this, like Pope endorses Donald Trump, get a lot of media attention, they are exceedingly rare in our media ecosystem. This is a figure from our 2020 Science Advances paper that quantified people's media diets. And so given this backdrop, I'm going to kind of reconsider this original premise, which is how much does online misinformation operationalize as the kind of things that get flagged by professional fact checkers that would fail a fact check really contribute to widespread societal harm? And so obviously this is a super huge question that I do not in any way perfectly answer over the course of this 30-minute, hour-long presentation. But what I'm going to hopefully do is present a framework for starting to think about this problem and apply it to a particular instance of misinformation that I think is relevant and illustrative, which is COVID vaccine misinformation. And so, 1 in 5 Americans refused a COVID vaccine, despite the vaccine being safe and effective for almost everyone. And misinformation on social media was really implicated as one of the reasons for this widespread refusal in the US. And so Biden, for example, was quoted as saying that Facebook and others were killing people by carrying COVID misinformation on the platform. And so the question that I'm going to kind of narrowly address in this talk is, is this correct? Did misinformation on Facebook have a meaningful impact on US vaccine hesitancy compared to the kinds of things that were not flagged as misinformation by fact checkers? And so rather than zoom in on misinformation in isolation, instead what I'm going to do is look across a broad spectrum of vaccine-related content on Facebook, identify or attempt to quantify how the effect of all of that content on vaccine hesitancy, and then back out how much of that resulting hesitancy was due to exposure to misinformation in particular. And so, so how am I going to try to do this? And so the way that I'm going to do this is break down this idea of the impact that content has. Did content on Facebook impact US vaccine hesitancy? If so, what type of content had the biggest impact? And I'm going to say it's related to 2 key components. The first is exposure. What kinds of content did people actually see on social media? And the second is the persuasive effect. Did it change their mind? And the intuition behind this framework is that for content to be broadly impactful at the scale of society, people have to see it, and it has to change their mind. And so that is the premise that I'm going to be working on for this talk. And to give an overview of where I'm going, how I'm going to apply this framework, first I'm going to talk about this persuasion component. I'm going to talk about randomized survey experiments that we ran measuring the persuasive effect of 130 different vaccine-related items on intentions to get a vaccine. Next, I'm going to talk about this exposure component. I'm going to talk about a data set that we got access to that helped us quantify exposure to all popular vaccine-related headlines on Facebook during the first 3 months of 2021, which is the key time period during the initial rollout of the vaccine in the US that we're zeroing in on. Then I'm going to kind of give a brief overview of a pipeline that incorporates crowdsourcing and natural language processing to extrapolate the results of these experiments to this larger set of Facebook data in order to get predicted persuasive effects for all the Facebook content on Facebook, all the vaccine-related content on Facebook. I'm then going to combine these persuasive effects with the exposure data, put it all together, and then get an estimate for the impact of Facebook information on vaccine hesitancy. So there's a lot of moving parts here. I'm going to go through them in more detail. I don't have time probably in this talk to go through every single step in as much detail as I could, but if people have questions, I'm happy to answer them at the end, or obviously encourage you to read the paper as well. Okay, so first talking about the data. So as I mentioned, first zeroing on this persuasion component. We ran 2 randomized survey experiments on Lucid, testing 130 different vaccine-related treatments on about 20,000 different subjects. And these subjects were kind of quota matched to be representative of US online Americans. The stimuli were drawn from like a sample of popular vaccine-related news, sourced mainly from Facebook, and contained both misinformation items as identified by fact checkers, as well as content that was factually accurate. And for each of these 130 different items, we estimated the persuasive effect of exposure to a vaccine-related story compared to a control story on people's future intentions to get a vaccine on a 100-point scale. So, obviously these are intentions and it's not behavior, but there has been work that shows that there are connections between people's intentions and behavior. These 2 things are correlated. And of course, we were kind of constrained by the fact that we were using surveys. And so our results are going to be about vaccine hesitancy and not so much on actual vaccination. Important to point out. So this is just an example of what this content looked like. We show people content for, in the same style as they would see it on social media. So they just saw the headline and the leads of the articles. They, were allowed to click into the articles. Very, very few people actually did. And as you can see, there's content from, high-quality sources like the BBC, as well as, low-quality sources like Gateway Pundit, spanning a variety of different topics. And so we end up with, again, these 130 different treatment effects for this large set of vaccine-related content. So those are our persuasion effects. Now moving on to talk about the exposure data. And so we got access to a data set called a Facebook URL shares data set through a partnership with Social Science One and Facebook. And this data set contained information about all URLs publicly shared greater than 100 times on Facebook, and importantly, the number of views of those URLs. And when I say the number of views, this was deduplicated on the URL level, and so this was kind of the total reach of the URLs, the number of Facebook accounts, Facebook users who saw each URL. From this data set, we identified 13,000 URLs about the vaccine that were posted during the first 3 months of 2021, which was the key time period in our analysis. And then for each URL, we have the number of views received in the US, the title of the URL, the description of the URL, the domain, et cetera. And this data set also includes information about whether the URL was flagged by Facebook's third-party fact checkers as misinformation. And so, how much misinformation about the vaccine did people see on Facebook during this time period? And so, first showing the total views of flagged misinformation. So all fact-checked misinformation during this time period was seen approximately 9 million times on Facebook, or by approximately 9 million accounts. And that might seem like a lot until I show you this, which is that content that was not flagged as misinformation on Facebook was seen 2.7 billion times during this time period. And I had to massively rescale this access to even get misinformation to really show up on this plot at all, to even be able to see it. And so, a natural question might be, as I said earlier, Facebook, is this kind of organic, or is this because of Facebook policy? And we can't really answer that question. We know that Facebook downranks content after it is fact-checked and identified as misinformation. But some things to consider here are a lot of times fact-checking happens, after the period of virality has passed, and so fact-checking often happens on a lag of like a day or two, at least. And so in many cases, the viewership of these URLs, they have already kind of gone viral by the time that they're fact-checked. And another thing is if you kind of calculate misinformation not based on their fact-check rating, but by the quality of the source, only 2% of views during this time period went to low-quality sources. And so, okay, looking at this, you think, okay, well, actually, maybe misinformation relatively was not as seen on Facebook. But I think a natural question is, what is happening in this blue bar? What are people seeing? And so here are the top 10 stories on Facebook during this time period. And I know you can't see it, but I'll explain. And just for context, this is the total views of misinformation during the same time period. So as you can see, the top 10 stories during this time period all received many, many more views than, frankly, all misinformation combined. And in fact, the most viewed story on Facebook during this time was this one here. And so this story by the Chicago Tribune has the headline, "A healthy doctor died 2 weeks after getting a COVID vaccine. The CDC is investigating why." And so, published by the Chicago Tribune, a Pulitzer Prize-winning outlet. Again, this story is not false. It does not fail a fact check. A healthy doctor did die subsequent to getting a COVID vaccine. But kind of later reporting showed that there was not a connection between the vaccine and the doctor's death. And of course, this headline also fails to mention the millions of people who did not die or suffer any consequence after getting a vaccine. Nonetheless, this story was the most popular story URL on Facebook during the first quarter of 2021. And it wasn't just this one story. There were many examples of similar stories that achieved incredible popularity on Facebook during this time. And so OC healthcare worker dies after receiving a second shot. Utah mom Cassidy Curl dies 4 days after second dose of Moderna. There's just 3 of the top 10 stories are about these kind of rare vaccine deaths. And so kind of given this context, we refer to these kinds of stories as vaccine skeptical. And we use this term to refer to content that is factually accurate, that is not failing a fact check, but nonetheless might cause vaccine hesitancy. And so ultimately where we're going to go is comparing the impact of that type of content with flagged misinformation. Okay, so moving on to some methodology. So as I said earlier, we have our 130 treatment effects for our that we tested for their effect on people's intentions to get a vaccine. We have our 13,000 Facebook vaccine-related headlines. And now, using a mix of crowdsourcing and natural language processing, we're going to estimate predicted treatment effects for all of the 13,000 Facebook headlines in our data set. So we're going to do this extrapolation procedure to predict what the treatment effect would be if people had encountered these stories on Facebook. And so how are we going to do this? Crowdsourcing. And so we relied on the wisdom of crowds to help us kind of scale up and identify the persuasiveness of vaccine-related content. And so we recruited about 150 people from Cloud Research's Mechanical Turk panel, and they each rated 20 of our 130 headlines. We got 22 ratings per headline. And we asked people to predict the treatment effect of each headline. We said, on a scale of 1 to 5, do you think that this is, do you think this would make people less likely or more likely to take a vaccine for COVID? And we also collected some other information about how harmful to health the crowd rated the headline, and also how accurate the crowd rated the headline. Because we found that these two features predicted variation in the treatment effects. And we averaged these variables together to create a crowdsourced aggregate score. It doesn't really matter if you just use the first kind of prediction variable or the kind of aggregate prediction variable. You get very similar results, but they're slightly more precise with the aggregate variable. And so can we use the crowd to predict treatment effects, to predict which headlines or stories are most likely to decrease people's willingness to get a vaccine? And so on the x-axis, I'm showing the crowdsourced score, and on the y-axis, I'm showing the observed treatment effect that we measured in our experiments. And we do find that that the crowd can predict variation in the treatment effects. And so each of these colored points here is a treatment effect, which is measured, of course, with sampling error. But once you account for that error, and you use the crowdsourced score to predict the treatment effects, you get a correlation of about 0.8 between the crowdsourced judgments and the actual observed treatment effects, which is pretty good. An interesting thing to note here, though, is if you split the score at the midpoint, which is 3, there's a lot of things that seem to lower people's willingness to get a vaccine. But there's not a lot that increases people's willingness to get a vaccine. And we actually really didn't find anything in our data that increased people's willingness to get a vaccine. And so while this story here about the DoD and Fauci getting caught in a massive scandal hiding death and damage from COVID vaccines was misinformation and lower people's willingness to get a vaccine as judged by the crowd, and so did this one from the BBC, Lisa Shaw, presenter's death due to complications of the COVID vaccine. This story here about Biden getting an additional COVID vaccine if his doctor recommends it, people thought would increase people's vaccine intentions, but had essentially a null effect. And we see this asymmetry between kind of positive and negative vaccine-related content, where negative content lowers people's willingness to get a vaccine, but positive content doesn't really do much to increase it. This is consistent with some other work in persuasion that kind of suggests that sometimes negative content is, bad is stronger than good, and negative content can be more persuasive than positive content. But kind of given this asymmetry, we're mostly going to zero in on this vaccine, this kind of negative content. And so that's great. It seems like the crowd can do a good job at helping us identify which stories lower people's willingness to get a vaccine. But one problem is that the crowd is not sufficiently scalable. So we have 13,000 headlines, and I mean we could get crowd labels for all of them, but it is not a super scalable process. And we also wanted to demonstrate that this was a system that could work, beyond this paper. And so what we did was gathered crowd labels for a sample of the headlines, 1,200, and then trained a BERT model to predict the crowd labels from the textual information about the story. And so, again, not going into too many details of this model, but it does a pretty good job. Also interesting to note, a friend and collaborator, Luke Hewitt, who's actually here at Stanford, repeated the same process using GPT. So used GPT to predict the treatment effects of, on people's intentions to get a vaccine, and found that GPT was incredibly predictive. And so if we're doing this again, we probably wouldn't even bother with this whole system. We would just use GPT. And so, interesting thing to know. Okay, so finally moving on to some results. Moment we've all been waiting for. We use this crowd machine pipeline to get predicted treatment effects for all 13,000 headlines in our Facebook dataset. Now I'm going to show two distributions. The first is going to be the predicted URL treatment effect for misinformation that's flagged by fact checkers versus content that was not flagged by fact checkers. So this is the distribution of treatment effects. So misinformation is in red here. And you look at this and you see, okay, misinformation seems like it's the problem. Misinformation, when people see it, has a much more negative effect on people's intentions to get a vaccine via our model than content that was not flagged. And so the typical piece of misinformation has an estimated treatment effect on vaccine intentions of about 1.3 percentage points, compared to essentially a null effect for content, for other kind of vaccine-related content. But what happens when I weight this distribution by exposure? It's a different story. And so again, I had to rescale the y-axis on this plot to even get misinformation to show up at all. And so if you look at this, you can see there is a lot of content that is not being flagged by fact checkers that is nearly as negatively persuasive as misinformation is, and is also being seen vastly, vastly more. And when you aggregate the impact, the relative impacts of these two things, we find that content that was not flagged and was predicted to lower vaccine intentions, first misinformation. We found that misinformation content lowered vaccine intentions by a predicted 0.5 percentage points per US Facebook user, compared to vaccine skeptical content, which lowered vaccine intentions by about 2.28 percentage points, according to our model, which is about a 50x difference. And so even though there's a lot of attention, a lot of discussion of the stuff in red here, what's missing from the conversation is the stuff in blue, the stuff that is not being flagged, that is still being shown to potentially cause harm. And so what are these stories that are most impactful? So as I mentioned, this one here, which got more than 50 million views on Facebook for this story alone, compared to 9 million for all misinformation. And again, these other stories of kind of young, healthy people dying after getting the COVID vaccine, which were the most harmful stories by this kind of framework that combines treatment effects and exposure. And again, these are just 3 examples, but there's in our data set, we see this again and again, and it's not just death, it's also severe side effects. It's also kind of normalizing and discussing vaccine refusal by healthcare workers. These kinds of stories are not misinformation, but are, by our estimates, the most harmful at increasing vaccine hesitancy on the platform. And so why is this important? I think that one major implication of this finding is that a lot of the current interventions, or past interventions maybe, targeting misinformation, target veracity or belief. And while that can be important, they might not be broadly effective when we think of harm as an outcome. So interventions like accuracy nudges, debunking and warning labels that are drawn from fact checker ratings, digital literacy, which is telling people to check the source of the website, source credibility labels. All of these interventions might not be effective if what we care about is not the kind of accuracy of a content, but rather whether or not it is going to contribute to these kind of widespread societal challenges. Okay. And so with that, I'm going to sum up. And so as I showed, misinformation has a large negative impact on vaccine intentions when people, compared to factually accurate content, when people see it. And so, fact checkers are good at identifying, the false, most egregious, worst content based on, they're doing something. However, exposure to that kind of content, the most egregious, the most obviously false content, is limited. And it is instead this kind of gray area vaccine skeptical content that had a bigger impact on vaccine intentions than these outright false claims. And so, far from from overreach, fact-checking really had a limited impact when it came to preventing widespread harm or widespread vaccine hesitancy. So a very back-of-the-envelope estimate suggests that exposure to this kind of unvetted vaccine-skeptical content potentially decreased vaccine uptake by up to 3 million people. So it's a potentially substantial effect. And so, what can we do about it? So future directions of this work. I think some of this analysis that I've shown suggests that we should reframe some of our discussion in misinformation. And so instead of studying misinformation as a noun and trying to sort content into content that is bad and false and good and true, instead we should try to study why people make misinformed decisions, regardless of kind of the very narrow accuracy of the content. And to that end, I have a project examining how media slant can mislead people on topics like the economy, crime, climate, that goes beyond just looking at kind of false stories. Second is, okay, well, how do we do anything about this? And I think one thing that this project introduces is the potential for a crowd-machine pipeline for tracking harmful content at scale. And so, in this work, I introduced kind of a methodology that uses real-world experimental data and crowds to kind of extrapolate that data and NLP to scale those judgments in order to identify vaccine skeptical content at scale. And you can imagine a similar pipeline being used to track other types of potentially harmful content at scale. So things like politically polarizing content, angering content. You can imagine a similar pipeline being used. And finally, it seems like fact-checking had a pretty limited scope. And there's this set of gray area content for which fact-checkers did not intervene. And I think there's a reasonable debate to be had about whether fact-checkers should intervene in those gray area cases. But I think that there's very reasonable pushback from people who have concerns about First Amendment, freedom of speech, and censorship, about intervening in fact-checking content that is not literally false. And this is obviously a conversation that is really relevant now, and we are seeing it with this new administration, that this question come up again. And so one solution that Meta is investing in, and has that been proposed by others, is investing in community content moderation. And so rather than relying on fact checkers to identify false content, using the community to identify content that is misleading or missing context. And so I have some work examining X's community notes, crowdsourced content moderation system, and trying to understand the dynamics there about how to harness partisan motives to actually increase public goods contributions and potentially surface these community notes in a way that's actually accurate, even if it is polarized. And so with that, I'm going to end. Happy to answer any questions. This is a link to the paper that I presented. Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you so much, Jen. Fantastic work. Congratulations again on that. And it's really a model paper for somebody coming from communication that thinks a little bit about, thinks about how media affects the way we think about the world. It's really a fantastic paper in terms of media effects. One of the things in the deception research area is that most lies are not bald-faced, like, straight up, right up lies. Mm-hmm. Many of them are, insinuations or omission and things like that. Is there anything you could tell us about the gray area? I mean, it's this massive amount of content that you identified. Is there anything systematic about the gray area content, or do you think like it's just, it can be anything and we don't know how to anticipate it, so we need to sort of take these more general approaches? Or is there something we can know about gray content?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I definitely think there are some patterns. I think cherry picking is a very classic example that we see. These rare cases like this, for example, this rare death after vaccination, a lot of crime, rare examples of, for example, immigrants committing crimes, being used to promote kind of a misleading narrative that, immigrants are responsible for the majority of crime in America, for example. Yeah. So I think that is a clear strategy that we see being used. And I think that there are many others, but I think it is difficult to identify. And I think there is a reason that Facebook's fact-checking instructions essentially said, provably false claims. Right. And I think there is a lot of discussion about, well, what context is necessary. And I don't know if there's always like the most systematic way of identifying when something is missing context. Mm-hmm. It's a very interesting area of work, though. Yeah. I'm interested.
Yeah, and so to stay on that second part around the effects, so one of the things your work shows is something that doesn't have anything really to do with technology, but is about being human. And so this idea that there's a affective asymmetry, right? That negative information matters more than positive information. How do we incorporate that into thinking about these technological or media issues when in some ways this is about human psychology?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to design with these things in mind. I think I think it is a little bit silly in some sense to, Meta, for example, talks about, we took down X number of pieces of misinformation. And, sometimes people measure in the kind of misinformation literature, something like discernment, where it's like, are people sharing more true information than they are sharing false information, and that's seen as a good thing. But the reality is that these two things don't necessarily offset each other. Like one false story might be 10 times as damaging as one true story. Just because you see one true story doesn't mean that you're negating all the false stories. Just because you see one positive story doesn't mean that you're negating all of the negative stories. Right. And so I think that definitely needs to be a consideration of the system, which is, and I think it's unfortunate, and I wish that this wasn't the case, that, you could, restore, media trust as easily as you kind of destroy media trust. And I think that, these asymmetries are realities that we do have to deal with. And especially from the platform's perspectives as well. Right.
Yeah, I mean, these sort of cognitive hacks are well known by people that want to persuade, right? So using narrative is really powerful, much more powerful than statistics. And so if you're talking about COVID vaccines, here's the 1 billion people that got vaccinated and didn't die. Here's the 3 people that did, and here's their names. And so it's really, it seems like a difficult thing to have to combat. And I want to bring that to one of your conclusions, which was around current interventions. You'd mentioned accuracy nudges, source accreditation. I agree, those seem problematic if it's not about the Chicago Tribune is not going to get a flag, and you should think that that's an accurate thing. You also included digital literacy. So I'm just wondering, are there ways in which we could train people then to be resistant to these? I'm thinking of pre-bunking. Hey, if this makes you really angry, if something makes you really angry, then maybe that's something to be suspicious about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that trying to understand what interventions work is an area of research that I'm really interested in. I think pre-bunking, I think that, advocates of pre-bunking would say that it would work on this kind of content. I haven't seen, I think that unfortunately there's a great paper about climate disinformation that shows that pre-bunking is not as effective at preventing persuasion as potentially we'd hoped. And so I think it's not clear. I don't have like a perfect solution. And I don't think there is going to be one perfect solution no matter what. But I think it's about trying to piece together a wide suite of solutions. And that's on the kind of individual side. How can we teach people? And I think that there are things that we can do. That's not going to be perfect. But then I think that there is also many things that we could do on the platform side as well. Whether platforms are going to do that in this particular moment, I think it's less clear, but I think that it's not going to be one or the other.
Yeah, great. I'll ask one more and then I'll open up to the crowd. I thought it was a really interesting move that you made where it was like, let's move away from, say, fact-checking and into understanding harmful content and their trajectories. And I really like that because you were thinking about like people's decision making ultimately, right? Because it's not what they were exposed to per se, but what they end up deciding to do. And about that sort of the changes in the moment in the current era we're in, you said around like, decision making that leads to harmful outcomes. The COVID example raises that question, like, well, some people wouldn't say that was harmful, like you shouldn't get COVID. So how do you think about what is harmful versus not when you make that move to decision making in an era where we're currently changing what we, at least at the government level, value as harmful or not?
Yeah, I think that, defining harm is also incredibly fraught. And, sometimes there isn't as clear. I think the COVID case is, I think you're right in saying that many people would object and say that, no one should have gotten vaccinated. But I think there is broad, widespread agreement that vaccination is in general a positive thing. I think that there's not always, widespread agreement. And I think, polarization is something that I think a lot of people think of as a harm. But then you might say that people are polarized and that comes along with things like political engagement and motivating people to vote and things like that. And so I think that there isn't going to be one kind of obvious thing that everyone agrees on as harmful, versus not harmful. But I think, looking at, doing research and seeing what kinds of content people are identifying as harmful and what kind of values that they are saying are important when it comes to what they want to see on platforms is one way to go. And I think a lot of times what people say that they want to see is not necessarily what they see reflected on the platforms. And so, I think that is an area of future work.
Okay, great. Excellent. Let's open up to, go ahead.
Jennifer, my name is Divya. I'm a senior here studying technology and policy. And my question for
Divya, hold on. Grab the mic there so the people at home can hear.
Divya, senior.
Hello. Okay, great. Divya, senior, studying computer science and political science. And my question for you is around, I really liked your phrasing of misinformed and misleading decision making. What onus do people versus platforms have in reaction to this type of harmful content? So, like, I guess, how much responsibility do people themselves have to critical think over these not strictly misinformation posts versus the platforms themselves? What would be your advice there?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it is kind of an uncomfortable truth of misinformation research and kind of social media research in general, which is that people like content that is bad for them, and they share content that is engaging, but is polarizing, or that questions the vaccine because they think it's interesting or something like that. And it is kind of a good question of is it too paternalistic to say that this is a misinformed decision or something like that. But I think, like, to go back to my earlier point, like, I think that there's a long way to go between what platforms currently optimize for versus what I think people want on platforms. And I think that there's a really interesting stream of work that's looking at alternatives to engagement-based ranking and trying to identify other ways of finding like what content people enjoy on platforms or want to see. And I think that changing some of the structure of the way that social media shows people content would be both, I think, good for the world and also be respecting what people want and their choices and not be as paternalistic of a choice. And so I'm really interested in that work, and a lot of that work is actually happening here at Stanford. So.
Hi. So I have a question that's about, measurement. And you said you started with 13,000 headlines from Facebook. I wanted to just ask, how are those just like the top most visited headlines or news stories in the period that you were studying? How did you identify them? And then, secondly, when you call them vaccine skeptical content, but is that like a label that comes from the fact that they had this treatment effect of reducing? How do you separate? Is there a way to separate what the content is and what it does to the people, or is there an assumption that because it had that effect that it's vaccine, that you can label it as vaccine skeptical content?
Yes, great questions. So in terms of how we found the URLs, so we used the Facebook URL shares data set, and we just searched for URLs that had vaccine or related terms in the in either the URL string or the title or the description. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that exact querying process. But the Facebook URL shares data set has information about all URLs shared on Facebook, but is limited to stories that are shared greater than 100 times publicly. And so it's really only content that is public. So it's not like someone's Google Doc or something like that. It wouldn't be included in this data set. So it's content that is meant to be shared publicly. But I think it is, you can think of it as all URLs that were at least minimally popular, got any kind of minimal amount of traction on Facebook during this time period. But would love to know if you're worried about kind of other types of content we might be missing or something like that. And to your second question, yes, so we are using this term vaccine skeptical. We're kind of thinking of it as two different dimensions. And so one is this content misinformation or not? And to operationalize that, we basically say, did you fail a fact check or not? And then the other dimension of content is, did you decrease intentions to get a vaccine or not? And so we're using the term vaccine skeptical to refer to content that decreased people's intentions to get a vaccine, but did not fall into this category of misinformation. So there is not so I think that there is content that maybe people would say is, accurate, wholly accurate content that is still skepticism inducing. And we are not disentangling those things in this particular, does that make sense?
I really like the idea of weighting impact by exposure. I think that's a big contribution. I was just wondering if you could think about, or maybe you already have thought about, how to focus on different subpopulations within that framework. So I'm thinking about on the exposure side, your work and others shows, for example, older adults more likely to be exposed to blatantly false things. In this context, on the impact side, getting a COVID vaccine may also be especially important for older populations who may suffer greater consequences from the COVID vaccine. So is there a way to, within this sort of framework that seems very much at the population level, have you looked at all within subpopulations, thinking about weighted impact by exposure within those groups?
To some extent, yes. And so the Facebook Social Science 1 URLs data set has some demographic buckets. And so we can look across age, political leaning, and gender, I think. And we do, interestingly, I believe we find that as a proportion of their feeds, younger people see more of this vaccine skeptical and misinformation content. And so it is kind of different from the pattern that is kind of the typical pattern. Although obviously older adults just consume much more news in general. And another interesting thing that we found is that users who didn't have a political there's obviously kind of an asymmetry where people on the right consumed more of this against vaccine skepticism-inducing content than people on the left, although I think there was like a minimum 10% of the content in all demographic subgroups was this kind of hesitancy-inducing skeptical content. But interestingly, I think one of the biggest populations that we found this content to be popular in is people who are kind of not politically affiliated. And so Facebook has this way of predicting if people are, some model that's basically predicting if you're a Democrat or Republican. But 75% of people are kind of nothing. And actually, like one of the groups that had the largest proportion of vaccine skeptical content were these kind of politically, less politically affiliated people.
Do you have any thoughts on why these populations would have different reactions? I'm going back to the narrative thing. So is it like adolescents and unaligned people are more susceptible to? Oh, is it not? Thanks, Ben. Yeah. Why might some subpopulations be more susceptible, do you think, to these kinds of gray area or the narrative approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's. I honestly don't have a great answer. I mean, it's clear. It's definitely true that vaccine hesitancy was more prevalent, and more people who are younger refuse the vaccine. Obviously, the causality is like not obvious there. It could go both directions. But yeah, I think it's possible that those narratives were more salient for younger people. These examples of young, healthy person died after getting the COVID vaccine, maybe that would resonate more among those populations.
Good timing. Could we take it up a little bit and think about the policy changes at Meta? So what are you seeing right now as some of the big questions as Meta goes through this change in policy, both here in the US and internationally?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of open questions. I think one question that this work raises is, yes, I think that it's not a good thing that Facebook is getting rid of its third-party fact-checking program, but it's also clear that it was not wholly effective. There was clearly, it was quite limited in its scale. And so even though I think that a lot of these policy changes seem clearly, politically motivated, and, the switch from fact-checking to community notes and the timing of the announcement and kind of the language around it are clearly kind of pandering towards the new administration. But it's not clear to me that switching to community notes is a bad choice or would lead there to be, a greater proliferation of misinformation compared to the prior status quo. And so I think that's something that we should study and we should look out for and try to measure. I think also, I think things that have not necessarily gotten as much attention as getting rid of fact checkers, but if there are kind of changes in the ranking systems, there's, I think, kind of safeguards that are in the ranking systems to promote trustworthy content or demote kind of untrustworthy content. And to the extent that those are shifting, I think I would be also concerned and think it's important to track and to study. Mm-hmm. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's really only in the US that they're getting rid of the fact-checking program. And to compare US versus other countries where I think there is kind of obligation for there to be fact-checking, particularly in the EU, I think it would be like an interesting case study to compare how the information on those platforms evolve.
Great. Question here.
Thanks. Thank you for joining us. I have a question, sort of just like a gut check question about the actual effects that this study uses. It seems like from taking a quick look at it, I know you didn't have much time to talk about it during the presentation, but it's based on like you expose real people to the stories and then they rank how likely would this be to affect my decision whether to vaccinate or not. My understanding is like in the political science context, generally there's an understanding that those effects decay really quickly, and so exposure to things like ads tends to have very little effect on actual voting later on. So like just continuing like the election analogy, I don't know who the two candidates for president will be in 2028, but like if you give me one piece of information, which is the party, I can like tell you who I'll vote for with like 99% confidence. I don't think there's any news story that would change that unless someone's like killing puppies. So do you think that these like survey results, are they really predicting whether people went out and got vaccinated or not?
Right. I think that's a limitation with our paper for sure. And I think, much of this work, especially like we're doing work on misinformation and we want to, debrief people afterwards. And so we're not, for example, able to really follow them for ethical reasons for a period of time. But I agree that likely these results decay. And so these percentages that I was presenting, they might kind of decay over time, and the rate of decay, I do some modeling in the paper, but I think that there's a range of potential decay, and how additive are these effects? Some work shows that the effects are additive, and so if you show someone one piece of content and you show someone a second piece of content, then the result scales linearly, but it could also scale sublinearly. All of these kind of questions of functional form and decay. And how do you translate hesitancy into actual choices to get a vaccine? This is an AT has a paper that shows that there's a 0.6 correlation between intentions and uptake, and so we think that these things are correlated, but how correlated are they? I think that's also unclear. There's a lot of different ways that these estimates might change. I would kind of consider these estimates as a proxy, as a best guess, as a back of the envelope calculation, rather than like this is the number. I would definitely be interested in trying to find other ways of modeling the effects as well.
Great. So let's wrap it up with a question for you. Given all the turbulence right now and changes in this space, making it kind of extra interesting, what are you most excited about for the next little bit, and what do you think is the biggest challenge for either people doing research in this space or policymakers?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about excited. I mean, I think it's kind of a terrible thing that for misinformation researchers, what's bad for the world is maybe good for the research. But I think that like the changes and the rollout of community notes and expansion, I do think that it is an interesting model that I'm excited to see. And I was, before kind of all of this kind of recent policy changes, I was kind of advocating for more widespread use of community notes and community fact checking. And so I am excited to see, how that unfolds. But I think it's also important to consider that, just because you want there to be community fact checking doesn't mean that any kind of system that you implement is going to work and work well and work even in the same way as on Twitter or X. And so I think, something that I'd be really watching out for is how they're actually rolling that out, how they're recruiting people, what are they making their data open, what kind of algorithms are they using to surface notes and create consensus. And so that's something I'm really interested in and interested to see.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Jen for a great talk and discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.